We've come to this village to investigate the fascinating story of beauty and division. We're going to find out about one of the most extraordinary and beautiful church interiors that you'll find for miles around, and how that came from a period of change and division and challenge in this local community. We'll find out about the Duke of Newcastle and his desire to impose his style of religion upon the villagers, and how a wealthy man from Sheffield, formerly of this village, stood up against the Duke and supported the Methodists in return. We'll also see two fascinating medieval sites, a Norman Motte and Bailey castle and a beautiful moated site with medieval fish ponds. And my first stop, I'm going to head off towards the church, which is up here. Let's start our story of Egmanton here at the parish church. A church actually which many people don't even notice because it is so hidden behind trees. Fittingly perhaps for a place that's on the edge of Sherwood Forest. Indeed, it was once in Sherwood Forest, and Egmanton was part of the forest until 1227. So it's always been a little bit of a remote and somewhat isolated place. But the event that changed the fortunes of the village was sometime before the 12th century. One of the local people had a vision of the Virgin Mary just outside the village, and that stimulated a very considerable medieval pilgrimage trade. There's still a place locally known as Lady Wood, which is believed that that's where the vision took place. But what we do have is a little sign perhaps of what the pilgrims left when they came to visit the church. So let's have a look at the doorway in a bit more detail. Well, I scratched into the doorway a number of little crosses, usually with points made at the end of each arm and then a cross shape, and one or two actually have got lots of little tiny pinpricks in a circle around them. And some people tell us that these are pilgrim crosses, that they were left when people came on pilgrimage to the church. Although other people claim that they actually are signs where people made a business contract and then crossed it to show that it was a commitment. Either way, they're very old and very fascinating and well worth a look. So perhaps these are the pilgrim crosses left by the pilgrims who came to see the shrine of Our Lady of Egmanton. But that was destroyed in the Reformation in 1547, and so Egmanton went back to being a bit of an out-of-the-way place of no particular interest. In fact, such an out-of-the-way place that it was one of the last villages in England to have its fields enclosed in 1821. And also a sort of place that was famous for burglars. In the 1840s and 50s, there were two gangs of burglars who lived here who terrorised the area. And another very strange story from the old days, there's the vicar was having his vicarage rebuilt, and under the floor of the kitchen they found the body of a person. So you imagine what sort of a village that might happen in. But actually something very extraordinary happened only a few decades after that, and this church once more became a place of interest and actually of pilgrimage. This is just an amazing surprise for anyone who's not expecting such an extraordinary scene in a little country church like this. It must have a huge impact. You know, you come through a dark little entranceway and then you're just hit by this riot of colour. It's one of the most fantastic chancel screens that I've ever seen in a little country church, and probably would grace many greater centres than this. And then I look above the door that I've just come through, and we've got an extraordinary organ screen. You find it difficult to believe that this is a little country church and it has this magnificent structure full of beautiful detail. And then as we look around the church, we start to pick up other things of interest. There's a pulpit, which is based on a design from Ghent in Belgium, and just many other things of interest that I'm going to go and have a look at. Well, I've been really enjoying looking around the church, but even more exciting now, I'm going to go up this fabulous cast iron spiral staircase on top of the chancel screen. I found myself a nice, comfortable, if slightly precarious seat up here on the chancel screen at the old organ console. And it's an interesting place to sort of reflect on how come this church is as remarkable as it is. And it's all really to do with the Dukes of Newcastle, important local landowners at Clumber Park. And in the 1830s, they bought patronage of this parish, which gave them the control of the Church of England here, effectively. And that started with the fourth Duke, who in the 1830s was notoriously opposed to any form of non-conformist activity. And in his village at Bottomsall, for example, no Methodist chapel was ever allowed. He was also very, very reactionary, and for a time dubbed the most unpopular man in England. In fact, the people of Nottingham burnt his house down for him because they hated him so much. So he was very anti any dissenting attitude in the area. And then later on we had the seventh Duke, who actually took a step further and became very, very Anglo-Catholic, which meant that he was technically Church of England, but he supported a style of worship and a style of church decoration that was very Roman Catholic. Hence here we get all these figures of Mary. And all the churches that he controlled, he tried to bring them into his sort of view of life. He appointed vicars who he thought would follow his views. Although on one occasion he made the mistake of appointing an aristocratic vicar who turned out to be an evangelical, which he didn't like at all. And then in the 1890s, he commissioned Ninian Comper to come and redesign this church. And most of this fantastic stuff that we've got here is Ninian Comper's work. An interesting question we might say is, well, this is 10-12 miles from Clumber. Why was this church so important to him that he would spend money on it in this way? And perhaps one clue is in the old medieval tradition of the pilgrimages. So there was a tradition to build on. But perhaps there's another clue, which is in the attitude of the people of Egmanton, who are perhaps not quite as attuned to the Duke's view of religion as he wanted them to be. So we're going to find out about some of that. Well, that was absolutely fantastic. But what I'm interested in is this idea about why the Duke didn't have total control of this village. And there's a really important clue about that round behind the church. Now, right behind this church is a remarkably well-preserved early Norman Motte and Bailey castle, known locally as Gaddick Hill. And according to tradition, everybody used to come here on Pancake Day and that sort of thing and roll down the hill. But it's actually one of 5 or 6 small castles that were built around the edge of Sherwood Forest. There's one here and there's another one at Laxton a couple of miles away. In fact, there's an amusing local legend that the 2 castles here and at Laxton were controlled by 2 rival sisters who used to go up on the battlements every evening and shout at each other. Well, they must have had some big lungs, mustn't they? But it's actually a really interesting piece of history. Now, normally in a village you might have a Motte and Bailey castle like this, and that was the home of the lord of the manor. One of the strange things though about Egmanton was that it had two lords of the manor, and this was only one of them. So eventually this became Manor Farm. It was part of one estate, and the Duke of Newcastle, when he got interested in Egmanton, he bought the other manor. So we had two separate manors and two separate lords. So Newcastle never was able to get the control here that he wanted, because he could never control the whole village. In fact, this manor eventually passed through various owners and was part of the Rufford estate up until 1938, when they had a sort of fire sale of property. And the Newcastles, they came in, particularly in the 1830s, were never able to establish complete control of Egmanton. They controlled the church, but they didn't control everybody who lived here. So we know that the reason Egmanton was an open village was because it had two manors. And in fact, we know right back to the Domesday Book time, there were two manors then as well. One was by the church, where was the other one? So we've come looking at probably the most likely place. People believe that out here on the western side of the village was where the previous manor was. Some have suggested it was on the hill behind me, but others have suggested that actually it's this site here. And I'm standing on the edge of a square moated site that's on the Ordnance Survey map as fish ponds, because the middle of it there are three fish ponds. And so the suggestion is that this was originally a moated manor site, that the fish ponds were constructed in the middle after the manor was abandoned. And we do know that fragments from this manor were taken up to the farmhouse that's on the hilltop over in that direction and incorporated into a door and a window in centuries gone by. This is a fascinating site. It's one of Nottinghamshire's best preserved medieval fish ponds. You can work out how the whole system worked here, but it seems to have been built using a site that was already fortified by a moat. Particularly worth visiting in winter. The public footpath comes right past the side. It's frozen, full of water. It's a fantastic place. We've now come down to the other end of Egmanton, and I'm standing just across the road from the Methodist church, or the Wesleyan chapel as it's actually labelled, from 1894. What we do know is that the Methodists had quite a difficult beginning here in this village. They talk about having to worship secretly because they were disapproved of, and actually finding it difficult to get hold of a piece of land. This piece of land was given to them by the farmers, the Price family, whose gravestones we still find in the village to this day. And they managed to establish a chapel here, which you can see has been rebuilt in 1894. For much of the 1800s, the mid-1800s certainly, relationships here between the Methodists and the Church of England were quite cordial. It wasn't like in Bothamsall, the Duke of Newcastle's other village, where Methodists were actually thrown out of the village on a number of occasions. Relationships were good until the 1890s, and this seems to have coincided with the 7th Duke and his ritualistic tendencies, bringing the worship of Mary into Egmanton. And so we start to get complaints in the newspapers, orchestrated by a man called Edwin Richmond, who was a Methodist from Egmanton who'd moved to Sheffield and become very influential in politics there. And so we see complaints in the newspaper that Methodists of Egmanton were being deprived of their share of the Egmanton charities, for example. That the school, which was an Anglican school, was much more hardline in its Anglican lines on worship, and so relationships declined. The Methodists were quite happy to put some abuse back into it, by the way. They got newspapers to comment on the ritualistic and Romanising practices in the alleged Protestant church, by which they meant the Church of England. Well, Edwin Richmond was a man on a mission. He was concerned that the Vicar of Egmanton, Frederick Harvey, was really turning back the clock of the Reformation, and village Methodist children were having to be subjected to that at the school. And as a wealthy man with influence, he decided to do something for the village Methodists of his home village. And in 1911, he helped raise the money for an extension to the Methodist chapel that you can see at the back here, which was specifically for a school, to provide space for 200 and for children to be educated on a Sunday. And such were his connections that the money for this was raised not just in Egmanton, but in Sheffield, and indeed as far across the world as Vancouver. And as part of the opening ceremony, he brought dignitaries to here from Sheffield, including the Lord Mayor of Sheffield and 3 of his predecessor Lord Mayors, which must have made quite a sight in a tiny little village like Egmanton. So this schoolroom at the back is a symbol of a village divided, of the Newcastles trying to impose their view of Christianity on a village which was mainly Methodist. Actually, the Duke of Newcastle's failure to get this village totally under his control is further evidenced by this building, or what remains of this building, because this was the primitive Methodist chapel, built in 1841 and possibly in use for 40 years or so. And it was often said in rural parts of England that the farmers went to the Methodist church and the farm labourers went to the primitive Methodist church, and this is what's left of it. Apparently they could see 80 people in this building. By about 1880 though, the primitive Methodist chapel had closed, and this actually became a village blacksmith's for a while, which was ironic because an earlier blacksmith had actually walked out of the village pub drunk, walked across the road, fallen in the beck and drowned. And that's exactly the sort of story that a primitive Methodist preacher would love to tell in their frequent temperance campaigns. So what we've seen is how the Duke of Newcastle in the 1890s tried to bring this village round to his view of Christianity by bringing in a really completely different style of worship in the parish church here in this village, and how he then found an opponent in Edwin Richmond, now of Sheffield, who was prepared to take him on and spend money to strengthen the Methodist cause in return. And Richmond was certainly a dedicated Methodist. We know, for example, that during his time as a councillor in Sheffield, one of the things he did was to get all the Sheffield public libraries to cut out the pages of daily newspapers which had information about betting on horse races. So he was a true Methodist of his time. But actually, the Methodists here did very well and remained influential for a long time, until, in fact, the 1930s, when the Church of England started to talk about needing to merge this tiny parish into Curtin Parish a couple of miles away. And the vicar at the time, Silas Harris, was a very strong Anglo-Catholic, and he hit the headlines in his response to this. I'm just going to read you some extracts from the paper. Speaking on this matter, the vicar of Egmanton, the Reverend Harris, said the conditions in the village were unbelievable. Well, what sort of conditions do you think were unbelievable? The village, he said, was tyrannised and dominated by the dissenters, by which he meant Methodists. All the power was in the hands of the farmers, who almost without exception were dissenters, and one could not get work on the land or a cottage if one went to church. Also, they were forcing the value of the glebe down or keeping it untenanted. So here was a case of the biter bit. The tactics used by the Newcastles in the villages where they had total control were apparently now being used against their side in a village where they didn't have total control. Well, this comment by the vicar earned a response, and the following week the Tuxford Methodist minister responsible for this circuit, he replied, and he said, "The farmers referred to by Mr. Harris are in no way men of religious intolerance, but Christians who have the welfare of the Christian church as a whole at heart. They rejoice in their Methodist heritage, but have no quarrel or any bitterness against others, because they are in communion with the Church of England. Is it not more than unfortunate that the vicar should have spoken as he did, giving the impression that two bodies of Christian people in one village were hardly on speaking terms? This definitely is not the case, and harm is done to the cause of Christianity by such bitter talk and feeling." Well, that was 80 years ago. Now, of course, Egmanton is indeed merged with other parishes. The Methodist Church and the Primitive Methodist Church are both closed, and all we have is one little parish church, supported perhaps by regular pilgrimages for those devoted to the cult of Our Lady of Egmanton. So a very strange story in this village. I hope you found this video enjoyable. If you'd like to see more, don't forget to press the like button. We publish books on various issues about Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire and Christian history, and we'd love to see you on another video. Thank you.